Okay, so this is an outline of what we're going to talk about in the presentation. So we're going to go over the management history, life history, stock assessment results, the recent science and research needs. We're going to talk about federal and state waters management, a study on stakeholder perspectives. We're going to go over some management options and talk about the next steps, then the question and answer, then the clickers. So first, some management history on Goliath. So Goliath are managed in state waters by the FWC and in federal waters by the Gulf and South Atlantic Councils. So during the 1980s, the popularity of targeting Goliath grouper really increased and the species became overfished. So in '83, the South Atlantic Council prohibited spearing in federal waters. And then in '85, the state of Florida set an 18-inch minimum size limit. In '86, the state of Florida added Goliath grouper to their 5-fish grouper aggregate bag limit. In 1989, the Gulf Council set a 50-inch minimum size limit. And then due to the fact that the species was still in decline, harvest was prohibited by the state of Florida and the Gulf and South Atlantic Councils. They all prohibited harvest in 1990, so that was state and federal waters. In 1991, Goliath was a candidate for listing and given species of special concern status, and in '94, it was listed as critically endangered by the IUCN. A little bit more about the history. So in 2006, it was removed from NOAA fisheries species of special concern list, but it was still considered critically endangered by the IUCN. So there's some countries in the Caribbean that have a harvest of Goliath prohibited, and then there are some countries that still allow harvest, such as Honduras and Belize. In 2011, the councils requested that NOAA fisheries work with the FWC to determine how to move Goliath grouper beyond the moratorium. So this is as the stock is rebuilding, they are asking, how can we move this species beyond the moratorium? So the councils formed a joint ad hoc council Goliath grouper committee. It had members of both councils as well as scientists, and the committee was formed to determine if there were enough data available to conduct another stock assessment. So the committee met multiple times and ultimately decided that there was enough new data to conduct another stock assessment. FWC agreed to take the lead on that stock assessment, and so that joint committee was dissolved. That stock assessment was completed in 2016. This went through the federal process. It's called CDAR, Southeast Data Assessment and Review, and this stock assessment was reviewed by a panel of independent experts and ultimately rejected for use for federal management. So following that rejection, the councils chose to take no action on Goliath grouper for federal waters. A little bit more background on Goliath. So the decline in Goliath was caused by a number of factors. So we've already talked about the fact that it was a popular fishing target. Goliath grouper are also long-lived, and their habitat, juvenile habitat, which is mangroves, has been in decline. And also, Goliath grouper concentrate in places where fishermen congregate and like to fish. So this made them easily removed at the time when they were open to harvest. So the councils considered the long-lived nature and some other biological factors about Goliath grouper, and they set a very high management goal of 50% SPR, or 50% spawning potential ratio. And stock assessments for Goliath have been conducted in 2004, 2010, and 2016, and all of those stock assessments were rejected for use in federal management. So a little bit about Goliath grouper distribution and biology. So historically, they ranged from Florida to Brazil. They were throughout the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. Their current distribution, or their center of population abundance, is really concentrated in South Florida. So I've already mentioned that they're a long-lived species, so the oldest one that's been aged so far is 37 years old. But that particular fish was taken in the 1980s. That's when the population was already depressed. They're slow growing, they're late to mature, maturing at around 3 to 6 years of age. Spawning occurs in aggregations, primarily from July to September. And they're susceptible to large-scale mortality events like red tide and cold kills. and I'm going to show you a little bit more of that data in a little bit. So a little bit about their life history. So they aggregate offshore to spawn. They spawn at these defined sites during those summer months, primarily July to September. Then the larvae spend several weeks in the plankton, and they settle out on their preferred habitat, which is mangroves. And then they ultimately move offshore, usually around 5 or 6 years of age at the onset of sexual maturity. So a little bit more about that 2016 stock assessment. So I mentioned that this stock assessment was completed by FWC, it was FWRI, it was a federal stock assessment, and basically Goliath grouper, there's still a number of unknowns about Goliath, so it lacks the data that's typically used in standard stock assessments. So because of that and because of a number of other factors, this particular assessment was not accepted by this independent review panel. And part of this was because there's been over 20 years of no landings. Some of the historical landings data that we do have is somewhat uncertain. There's still some unknowns about Goliath's life history. And so this is really, it led the assessment, it really was unable to give a definitive determination about the status of the fishery. So this is considered a data poor stock assessment, and basically this type of stock assessment really can only provide what we call relative stock status. So it's evaluating the current stock relative to past abundance, and this is really the only option for these data poor species. But even though this assessment was rejected for federal management, it can be used for state management, and given the documented increases in abundance, the commission said that they wanted to consider a limited harvest that would not impact the stock recovery or compromise the progress that's been made thus far. So here's a graphic. It's from the stock assessment, and this is telling us a little bit about the 2010 cold kill. So a couple things to note. So you have juveniles in the top graph and adults in the bottom graph. And you can see that there's some increases in the population in the 2000s, which is what we would expect as a result of the species recovering. And then in 2010, which is where both of those arrows are pointing to on this graphic, so there was a long sustained cold weather event that really hit both the juveniles and the adults pretty hard, and you can see some decreases in abundance with these catch rate surveys or abundance graphs. These are a couple more graphics from the stock assessment. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the maximum age. So I mentioned earlier that the otoliths that we've had, the maximum age for a fish so far is 37 years. However, it's thought that they might live longer than 37 years. Remember, that particular fish was taken in the 80s when the population was already depressed. So in these graphics, we're looking at relative stock size. And so if we look over here on the left, and we assume that the maximum age is 37, and so you're trying to look at where's the population above this line, and we can see that the population is pretty good. You can see this uptick in the population. This is the error around this particular estimate that comes out of the stock assessment. So basically, if they live to be 37, then the stock is in really good shape. But if they live to be older, so in this graphic over here, it's estimated that they live to be a maximum age of 56 years, and this is just based on the fact that we have other groupers that live to be a lot longer than 37 years, so it's thought that that's not their maximum age. And you can see in this particular graphic that if you're looking at their relative abundance, it's a lot lower, and it doesn't look like the population is rebuilt, and then this is the error around that particular assessment. So the uncertainty in that maximum age is really contributing a lot to the uncertainty in the stock status for Goliath. So let me summarize a couple points about that 2016 stock assessment. So there are many data deficiencies or data gaps that are preventing the use of standard assessment methods, and these relative assessments that have to be used for these data poor species actually require more assumptions. However, the available indices of abundance that came out of the assessment, they're basically following similar patterns We do know that the harvest closure has increased abundance in South Florida, but not throughout the species' original range. And as I've mentioned a couple times, this review panel rejected the stock assessment, which prevented its use in federal management. So since the stock assessment, there's been some additional research and some ongoing research that I want to tell you about. So there's been some recent research on Goliath grouper spawning. This has been conducted by a group of Florida scientists, and it confirmed that spawning aggregation sites, they were identified in South Florida, and it was determined that some of the Southeast Florida sites were attracting fish from long distances. A lot of these sites were actually artificial reefs. This particular paper indicated that Goliath grouper might be hermaphroditic, and the particular Goliath that they took fin rays from in this study, the aging indicated that the fish at these particular sites were less than 20 years old. There's also a new technique out there, a genetic analysis technique for looking at population abundance. It's called close kin or next kin analysis, and this is something that our scientists at FWRI are actually working on. And it's exploring the use of this novel, non-lethal genetic method to try to get at Goliath grouper population abundance. And it's looking at the proportion of parent-offspring pairs to estimate the number of adults in the population. So this is in the relatively early stages. It's a pretty cool technique to look at the population another way. So a little bit more about Goliath grouper diet. So there's another study, a recent study that's out there about their diet. It is showing us that Goliath grouper are opportunistic feeders that consume a variety of benthic crustaceans or benthic invertebrates and bottom fish. So benthic invertebrates, it showed that they liked mostly crab species, but here in the Keys, they also ate some lobsters. These most common fish that they took were bait fish like scads and sardines, as well as burrfish. The study determined that less than 1% of the diet was snapper or grouper species, but as you probably know, if an angler has a struggling fish on the line or on a spear, that Goliath grouper are certainly willing to take that particular prey off of that spear or off the line. And also, Goliath grouper have been found to eat lionfish, but at this point, it is not necessarily a consistent component of the diet, but it has been found in the diet. So just a little bit about mercury. Since Goliath grouper have high site fidelity, this may increase their risk of exposure to contaminants and exacerbate bioaccumulation of certain elements like mercury. So the mercury concentrations that were found in Goliath are within the range known to cause direct health effects, and the mercury concentrations were higher in the larger Goliath grouper, so in ones that were greater than 4 feet. So right now there are not any health advisories on Goliath, and that's mostly because the fishery's been closed since the 1990s. There's also a recent study, an economic study on dive value. This was done in 2016 by the University of Miami. It was looking at recreational diver willingness to pay for Goliath grouper encounters. And it showed us that recreational divers were willing to pay around $100 for one Goliath grouper sighting, and their willingness to pay for Goliath grouper at the spawning aggregation sites was around $200. There was also a high consumer surplus for divers targeting Goliath grouper aggregations, and this consumer surplus would diminish with decreases in abundance of Goliath grouper. The study also found that divers from outside the state of Florida were willing to pay over $300 to see Goliath grouper at these aggregation sites. So there's a number of research needs out there on Goliath. So we definitely need more information on abundance over a broader part of their range, so not just from South Florida. We need more historic and contemporary stock productivity metrics. This is usually done for other stock assessments with fishery landings information, which is definitely lacking for Goliath grouper. We also would like to see some better information on reproduction. So we're not 100% certain that they're hermaphroditic, so we need to know more about this particular aspect. We also want to know more about their age. So Not only do we want to know how old they get, but we also want to make sure that we're getting older fish back in the population as part of this recovery. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the federal and state waters management. So in federal waters, once again, Goliath is managed by the Gulf and South Atlantic Councils, and they manage using an ABC, or an acceptable biological catch. Right now, the ABC for Goliath grouper is at 0. In order for the councils to allow some harvest, that ABC needs to be greater than 0, and this usually comes from an accepted stock assessment. So right now, the councils have no immediate plans to consider a harvest strategy for federal waters, and this is unlikely to change without an accepted federal stock assessment. And state waters, FWC can allow harvest in state waters, which is what we're discussing tonight. So there's a number of different stakeholder perspectives out there. There are people, especially members of the dive community, that want to preserve Goliath for ecotourism purposes. There are others who think that Goliath should be preserved for their role as a large predator in the marine ecosystem. Some people do not think that Goliath should be harvested. Some have concerns about Goliath distribution outside of Florida throughout their historic range. Some anglers consider Goliath a nuisance species because they often remove hooked fish from their line. And even though Goliath can currently be targeted for catch and release, there are also people who desire to harvest Goliath because of the unique nature of this particular opportunity. So there's a number of different perspectives out there, and this can be a controversial issue. There was a stakeholder perspective study done by the University of Florida, Kai Lorenzen, and he was looking at stakeholder experiences and attitudes and determined that they are diverse, particularly within recreational fishing groups. So for recreational hook and line fishers, he determined that they have a positive attitude toward Goliath encounters and the species' contribution to biodiversity, and they were moderately in favor of opening the fishery. Recreational spearfishers and commercial fishers viewed Goliath encounters and their ecological impacts more negatively, and they were more strongly in favor of opening the fishery to harvest. However, sightseeing divers, dive charters, and non-fishing conservation organizations viewed the contribution of Goliath to biodiversity as positive, and they opposed opening the fishery to harvest. So staff presented 2 different management options to the commission, and we're going to present 2 different options to you tonight. Those same 2 options, it's status quo or limited harvest. So I'm going to go over both of those. So for status quo, right now there is a thriving catch and release fishery that's allowed in state waters. No harvest is allowed. We feel that basically the status quo is maximizing the dive viewing opportunities. It's managing for high numbers of large fish, and Goliath's ecosystem value is being optimized. So there are some information needs that can be addressed even with the status quo management. So information on abundance and distribution can be obtained through fisher reports on a smartphone app, as well as continued collection of fin clips. So FWRI is working on a smartphone app that folks can use to geo-reference information when they find a Goliath grouper, whether they're diving or fishing, and they can report this information. So this app is still under development, and this app will give us that abundance and distribution information, as well as information about range expansion. So a limited harvest, so the goal of this would be to provide harvest opportunities on this recovering species without impacting the rate of recovery. And this, we would want to do this in a way that we would minimize impacts to the dive community and in a way that would not be expected to impact stocks sustainability. So there are a number of information needs that could be addressed with a limited harvest. So we could continue to get information on abundance and distribution through the app that I just talked about. We could also get some additional information on their ages and some additional information on their reproductive biology. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what limited harvest opportunity, what that might look like. So these are some of the sideboards that staff is presenting. So these were presented to the commissioners, and we're presenting them to you tonight. So as I mentioned earlier, FWC can only allow harvest for Goliath in state waters. There could be a random draw to choose the participants for who could harvest a Goliath. If chosen, a fee could be charged. That fee could be up to $300. It could be used to fund Goliath grouper research. It could require participants to purchase a recreational fishing license. So what that means is if you're currently exempt now, so let's say you're over the age of 65 and not required to have a license, we could ask you to purchase a recreational fishing license in order to participate in this unique opportunity. A recreational harvest tag could be issued that could allow the harvest of one fish per tag per person per year. 100 tags could be issued annually for 4 years via random drawing. The tags could be issued to recreational fishermen who could choose to then hire a guide. So we're not necessarily suggesting a certain number of tags for private anglers and then a different number for guides. We're suggesting just one number of tags. And if the participants want to hire a guide, that's up to them. Participants could be asked to hail in when they have a Goliath grouper on board so that a scientist could meet them to try to collect additional data from that fish. A little bit more about that limited harvest opportunity. So staff would be suggesting an allowable gear of hook and line only, a slot limit of 47 to 67 inches, suggesting only open areas that do not encompass spawning aggregations of Goliath, suggest harvest not be allowed during the spawning months of July to September, suggesting no commercial harvest or sale. As I mentioned, scientific sampling could occur on these fish that are brought in, and they could occur either at checkpoints or via cooler drop-offs of the carcass. And then people could use the app to report their harvest locations, as well as people that are non-consumptive divers and anglers who are practicing catch and release can also use the app to report sightings. So a little bit more about what it would look like if we were to pick these areas where Goliath are spawning and suggest no harvest at these spawning sites. So this is a blow-up of South Florida. So this red line is indicating state waters on one side, federal waters on the other side. So for example, here in the Gulf, these particular aggregations that we know about are in federal waters. Over here on the Atlantic, some of these are in state waters. Some of these are in federal waters. So let me zoom in on that area a little bit. So that's that same area zoomed in. So once again, these dots on this side are in state waters. These dots are in federal waters. So if the commission suggests that they want to do this limited harvest, we would probably come back out to workshop with maps and ask people about some additional sites that they might know about where Goliath would be spawning. And we would probably be doing something like drawing boxes or some type of polygons around these particular sites that we know about and not allowing harvest inside these particular aggregation sites. So one more time, the ways to comment on Goliath grouper. So we're going to have some questions for you that you're going to respond to via the clickers. You can also go on to that web page. So these cards are out front. It has the web page on the back where you can type in your comments. The same survey that you're going to take tonight is going to be online that people that don't attend the workshops can fill out. And also you can come to the December commission meeting and speak to the commissioners directly. So the timeline is we're doing workshops in August and October, and then we will bring all this information back to the commissioners in December. Right now, that commission meeting is set for December 6th and 7th, and it's tentatively set for Gainesville.